to Normalizing Men's Mental Health. I have the opportunity of interviewing Liz Ortenburger. She is the CEO of Safe Nest, and it was really interesting when I got proposed about the opportunity to speak with her. At first, I was unsure about where would the conversation go, but after speaking with her and going into more detail, and how intimate partner violence and how about 70% of relationships, the partners get back together and how we institutionalize the crimes. And we're not really focusing on the communication and also the emotions that are creating these crimes. What's the underlining area? We're just keeping one person safe, which has additional trauma, but then also how the other person is more likely going to repeat the same effects. So, that being said, welcome, Liz.
Thanks for having me.
Well, I had to say, I've really been thinking about this conversation ever since we talked on the phone about several weeks back. And I was like, whew, I'm really interested. And I want to ask, why did you get into this?
Yeah, so my career into domestic violence work was kind of interesting. I started really most of my career was in youth development for a good 30 years. And then I was actually recruited into the Las Vegas market by Girl Scouts and I came here and I was happily their CEO for 3 years. And then Vegas is an interesting place because there is so much need here in a lot of different sort of very safety net issues. So things that are on the front line, homelessness, drug addiction, all of these things. And so I kind of felt like Girl Scouts was important, but I wanted to move into something that was a little bit more front line. And a friend of mine asked me if I was interested in becoming the CEO at Safe Nest, which had one CEO for about 38 years. My predecessor was essentially the founder, took the organization through 38 years, and they were looking for new leadership. And I was like, first of all, I said I don't know a lot about birds because I was like, yeah, and animals aren't really my thing because I had not really had an intersectionality with safe nest before my time here. But I took a weekend class on domestic violence, just a kind of like an introductory, like, what is this thing? And I got incredibly passionate about it. And I could start to see over my first years here at Safe Nest that the movement had really focused on really the symptom of domestic violence, which is of course the survivor's journey, which not to diminish is incredibly difficult and incredibly important, but overwhelmingly we were doing nothing about the abuser, which was really the symptom of or sorry the root cause of domestic violence, and survivors were the symptom of that rage. And so I got incredibly interested in how can we do more about ending domestic violence. Otherwise, agencies like Safe Nest are going to have a tidal wave of survivors forever because we haven't actually ended it. And even if a survivor chooses to leave, sort of in 30% of those cases, we've only created a vacancy for another survivor. And if there's kids in the home and it's 70% go back and that abuse continues, those kids are going to repeat the cycle, which is what data plays out. So I got incredibly passionate about like, look, 50-year movement, we've looked at only really one element of this thing, and then we've relied on the criminal justice system to do the other part. Well, guess what? No surprise to anybody, the criminal justice system is failing miserably at creating any kind of a positive outcome for a domestic violence abuser. So here I sit sort of running this anti-domestic violence agency that works with survivors, but has been over the past 30 years working with abusers alongside, and we're ratcheting up those services so that we have a much more robust offering for abusers.
So, what was one of the shocks to you when you were actually started working with the abusers? Like, what was one of the biggest epiphanies for you?
Yeah, I think, I've heard people use the adage hurt people, right? But when we think about cycles of abuse and cycles of violence, um, abusers generally are also victims of abuse from childhood. And there is different sort of understanding of that in the space. There's a phenomenal writer in the abusive partner space called Lundy Bancroft. Lundy Bancroft does a phenomenal job of sort of saying, yes, that is true. And it is also a manipulation tactic for survivors and for survivors to stay, because now I'm in the space of trying to take care of you and help you through your trauma, even if that means abuse for me. But overwhelmingly, the data absolutely points to that abusive partners have high adverse childhood experience scores. And that's a scale of 1 to 10. Generally, what we see is people that have experienced 4 or more adverse childhood experiences before the age of 4 are much more likely to have a very difficult path forward. And that includes everything from repeating cycles of abuse, intravenous drug use, obesity, homelessness, job loss. I mean, the whole list goes on of all of the negative attributes associated with adverse childhood experiences, and abusers are no different. They get wrapped into that sort of lump of data around the negative outcomes. And when we ask our own abusive partners who come in for treatment and court mandated programming and the like, what is your adverse childhood experience score? It's an interesting thing that happens. If I ask you right away, I usually get a 0, right? Like, my childhood was fine, because men don't generally like to sort of be like, yeah, I was sexually abused as a kid, or my dad went to prison and that really affected me. That as men, that's a more difficult place. But if we take that adverse childhood experience score when we've built some trust and rapport with you as a client, the outcome is very different than we are seeing an average of 6 and 7.
It's the sexual abuse amongst boys and girls is a lot higher than I ever thought.
Yeah.
And until you walk in this realm, you don't realize the peek behind the curtain of how much sexual abuse is there. The When you were working with these people that have been abused, not even just sexually, but physically, divorces, violence, how are they about articulating their feelings? How are they about articulating their behaviors and what's prompting them?
Yeah, so the interesting thing about the way our classes work is the beginning, and most batterers intervention classes work the same way, or at least the ones that are well run, I think, do, is the first really 15 to 20 minutes of the hour that they're together, or of the 90 minutes they're together. Every person in the class, and classes are no bigger than 15, but usually about 10, has to share whether or not they viewed pornography, used violence, used profanity. They have to share the things that maybe they sort of didn't, they kind of failed at the week before. When men hold men accountable, that is a very different scenario, right? If I, as a female facilitator, am kind of leading the class, and I have somebody maybe who's newer in the class, maybe they're only 3 or 4 weeks in, and I have somebody who's 21 weeks in or 22 weeks in, the phenomenal thing that can happen, and does happen quite frequently in batterers intervention, is the new person coming in is like, no, I didn't use a cuss word last week. And then you've got the person who's been in for 22 weeks. It's like, that's bullshit, right? That is not true, right? We know, come on, you gotta, if you're gonna get anything out of this, you gotta be honest. And when that's coming from someone who has shared your journey, that is much more powerful than me as the facilitator being like, come on, you have to be honest. That men holding men accountable space is so underrepresented inside I think all movements. I think when we look at things like big brothers, big sisters, getting male mentors is so much harder than getting female mentors. When we see all of these spaces, it's like men as allies, men holding men accountable is so incredibly powerful, yet super underrepresented across the landscape of what boys need. So we end up with boys who don't have clarity in direction, or clarity in where they're heading, or how to deal with these difficult life concepts that they're having.
Do you believe that the feminine and masculine energy really helps orchestrate that ability to be vulnerable and holding each other accountable to be able to get that? I don't want to say that level of compliance, but the way of self acceptance of their own behaviors.
I do. I think when so the Navy actually really did this work in the beginning, which is always surprising to me. I mean, we have a huge Air Force base here. I have friends in the Air Force, and when I've heard the things that the military has done over the years to sort of demisogynize itself, I'm always incredibly impressed. And I'm like, you guys need to do more PR around this. Like, we need to understand this is happening, that our military is doing these great things. But the Navy really started this. They had a program, an MVP program, and it was really what was understood in that space, and the facilitator who did this was that you had to be a male who was in a position of respect in order to be able to hold other men accountable. So I talk to moms about this, like your son's social group. If he's starting a new school or a new sport or something, he, whether you want to believe it or not, is low man on the totem pole until he represents himself in a more physical way, in a way that boys sort of peacock themselves, take that leadership role, which means he can't walk into a group, hear profanity from another member, and call them on that behavior and expect there to be a positive outcome for him. He will be ostracized, right? This is just normal group dynamic. But when your son is in a space of leadership, either because they are a phenomenal athlete, because they're a natural leader, right? We all know boys that kind of walk into a space, kind of have that alpha energy, then they have a responsibility to be a voice to the others in the group and to hold those group members accountable. And this is
Hmm.
really what the Navy saw, right? Some of it was rank because the military, of course, operates in those very hierarchical fashions, but some of it was just even informal, like you're respected. And when you have that respect, so oftentimes in family units, I sort of say, look, uncles, grandpas, men who have this sort of respect within that unit, you are the right person to call somebody out on toxic behavior, not in front of everybody. You got to do it where people aren't losing face, but you're the respected voice. And with that respected voice comes a huge responsibility. And that's where I think men sometimes get lost in this dynamic. Um, as we talked about a little bit before we went on air, I'm working on my PhD. And when I was doing some of my practice interviews, I interviewed someone who had been an abuser, and that he explained to me, look, one of the most phenomenal relationships I had in my life was with a manager who seemed to care about me. Like one of the first times in my life, there was somebody that cared about me, but that manager didn't have the skill set to call him out on some of his toxic behaviors. And so this idea of male relationships and spaces that men are, how do we help men of respect understand their role, but then also understand the right words to use and the right context to use, and not to be afraid of a conversation that might have some conflict in it, because it will make society better.
It definitely does make society better when we have the ability to call people in. And I know that the language of calling them out and being able to let them know this is something that's not behaved, but then also using the similar language of calling them in and saying, hey, how do we actually allow you to learn that, yes, you might have been violent. Yes, you might have actually done something really wrong. How do we call those people that have been now ostracized and kicked out of the communities to be able to say that you can change, that we can create a new path together, and that life can look a lot different, but it will be uncomfortable at first.
Yeah, I mean, there's a huge, domestic violence skews into poverty, right? Women who are at and below the poverty line are 5 times more likely to be victims of abuse, which means the corollary statistic is that men who are at and below the poverty line are 5 times more likely to be abusive, right? And it's probably not exactly tit for tat, but it's in the ballpark. So when we think about systems of oppression and control for low income boys and men growing up, there's a lot. There is a lot to unpack there about, like, why would I be feeling oppressed by my environment, right? We tell men you need to protect and you need to provide, and then we rob low income men really of that opportunity, right? So then we're also oftentimes talking about violence in those communities as it relates to gang violence, drug violence, all of these other things. And you may or may not have been in a violent home growing up, or there was violence around you growing up, right? So when we take all of this context and say, okay, how do we help a young boy navigate all of these things that we can't control, right? I wish Safe Nest could go into any community and sort of wave a magic wand and make it a community that wasn't feeling the oppression the way many of our communities in Vegas do. But that is not my role, and that is certainly not the power that I have. the power that an agency like Safe Nest has, which is underrepresented, I think, in this movement, is to say, how do I come into a community or work with boys in that community or find resources for boys in that community so that they understand where they can find hope and where they can navigate into a different future and realize that life is not the situation they're in or the situation they've experienced does not have to be their future. And to me, that is one of the most powerful pathways that we can give young boys. Unfortunately, what we see a lot of in these neighborhoods and in the school systems and things like that is underfunding, right? Which
Hmm.
is huge. But then we also know that young boys get particularly attached to sports, and then start to realize kind of in third grade that maybe they're not the next phenomenal running back for whichever team, or they're not going to be that phenomenal soccer player. And interestingly enough, that's kind of where gang membership starts, right? And so third grade on, boys start realizing their way out is not going to be sports, or potentially another path if it's rap music or music in general or things that they've connected to. They start to lose hope, and then they start to sort of insulate themselves inside those communities. Well, there's huge responsibility for men, but a huge responsibility for agencies like Safe Nest, Big Brothers Big Sisters, Boys and Girls Club, all of us that are in those communities, to say, how are we attaching hope to these kids? And not hope that it's like, oh, I hope it doesn't rain today. Hope that your future can be different than your present and your past. And the second part that we really like to teach is violence is a choice, right? And that's super hard when you're surrounded by this sort of energy of violence, and violence is strength and violence is power and control. The fact that violence is a choice feels very foreign. So none of this comes easily or oftentimes organically to the neighborhood that you're growing up in, but we have to switch that narrative, and schools are a huge place to do that. But youth programs in general, sports programs, anything young people are engaged in is an opportunity for there to be a different outcome for that child.
You nailed it on the head when you said a lot of this is coming from lower socioeconomics. I was thinking about how many Marines actually go, how many people go into the Marine Corps, how many people go into the Army, typically come from lower socioeconomics. They crack a lot of jokes about the Army and the Marine Corps having ASVAB waivers, which is like a score, which a lot of people are very simple in the sense of that way. But at the same breath, they are not having many choices out there. They're not having as many role models out there in these communities. And being picked up by a gang, you're being accepted.
Mm-hmm.
And, or we could even say, like, person going into the clans, people are being accepted based off of where they grew up. It's how do we help invite men into those spaces when there's a big push about keeping men away from younger people, younger boys, and actually creating that community that it's actually safe and it is normal to have men as role models.
Yeah, that is a right. That is really, and I'm coming from a career in youth development. I will tell you that's the failing, right? I come, Girl Scouts and the YMCA are my two, prior longtime employers. Girl Scouts really ostracized men, from being part of that community, which I think they're regretting now because, first of all, women aren't available to volunteer at the same rates they were in the earlier 100-year history of Girl Scouts. But also, men play such a critical role in raising healthy girls. Like a girl's relationship with her dad and with healthy men in her life are very predictive of her relationships as she grows older and her romantic relationships. And so for boys, right, they are underrepresented in a lot of these cases, right? And so Safe Nest is happily, excitedly starting a scouting program, which is now both boys and girls, to get some of that positive modeling and those great activities to our kids that are dealing with some of the high ACE scores that our kiddos are. But in general, there's a great book called Cheering for Children, which talks about the changes youth development programs need to make, right? And that really is encompassing of men, positive male role models coming in and making these differences. I worry extensively about the boys that are in our care, particularly in our residential program, because Safe Nest is, we employ everybody, but we skew female in terms of who works for us. And certainly in our residential program, I'm happy to say our director is a male, which is great, because what I want my boys to see is positive male role models. If you're coming out of a domestic violence relationship, you generally as a kiddo have not seen positive male role models. And yes, sometimes it's mom who's abusive, and we work with that as well, but the majority of the time when we're working with kids, it's dad who's been abusive. And so how then am I supposed to help young girls and young boys develop positive images of men and positive connections? So men need to volunteer. You know, yes, men are sort of, I think, still in our very sort of quest to be more equal, still charged in the majority of families as the breadwinner. I don't know that the data on that, and I'm sure it's shifting, but we've got to find time, particularly for men whose kids are maybe older and you have more time, right? I'm not asking you to like leave the babies with grandma and go volunteer. Find a way to weave in some volunteerism into your life with young people. Male role models are so, I think, lacking, right? We look across the structure of who's teaching our kids. It skews female, and I think that's also shifting. But where are our kids finding positive male role models, both inside and outside the home, is really important. And we have an over, majority of men are great, phenomenal men. I think we have an over reporting on pedophilia and all these horrible things that can happen. And those things do happen. And yes, there needs to be safeguards in every program to protect kids from somebody who has ill intent, but that should not be the beacon of not allowing men to really be an incredible part of what kids need, particularly black and brown men.
Mhm.
Unfortunately, as we all know, our low income communities are overrepresented with black and brown boys, and so having phenomenal role models that look like you, that can share some of your life experience, that can show you you don't need to be the next Oprah, but you also don't need to repeat these cycles that your parents or your family has repeated. There's a path for you that can be life changing, and you don't have to life change 1,000 kids. Life change one. Be a big brother of one kid, right? Like that's all I'm asking, and that will start this shift in society, and boys will grow up differently, and have that to pull on.
I fully agree. As you were talking, you said that you have a male director. The therapist realm, it's about almost 80% of therapists are females or women, and 20% are males or men. And a big issue with it, also with social worker guys, there's this glass elevator. When they actually get into it, a lot of times they just go up to more of a director role or supervision role, where they're not having as much dialogue. And it really stunts the ability of having that emotional creativity or emotional like wherewithal of having it with another a dude. And as a person that has not been really taught or role modeled, like, hey, this is okay to talk about our feelings, instead of, I do believe there's a certain way of saying, hey, you know what, this hurts and you can do more, or let's actually finish this up and now let's talk about the challenges instead of just delaying the gratification or pushing it away. And I think about even my elementary school, and a lot of elementary school teachers are women, and there's nothing wrong with women. I believe if, especially since we're moving towards a generation of equality across the board, and how can we actually promote guys also being able to talk and heal? Because if we're not using the words that you're saying, holding each other accountable, we're not able to call each other in. And a father that is able to show a boy how to actually change a tire on a bicycle, that memory is going to last with them for the rest of their life, compared to a person that's not able to be in their life or a person that's yelling. They're going to remember that type of conversation. So I agree with what you're saying about showing up in one person's life, because those little bit of changes have huge lasting results, and we start pushing against this toxic narrative.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's, and I certainly don't blame men for not being part of the feminist domestic violence movement. The roots were very feminist. There has been somewhat of an ostracization of men, I think, inside this movement. But it's time for the movement to change and
Hmm.
to be much more differently accepting of how men are invited to show up, how they're invited to be there, how they're invited to be part of not only the kids' lives of the work that we do, but the lives of the survivors that we serve in general. And you're right. I mean, when I look across the landscape of my staff that are on the front line working directly with clients, it is about 30% male and 70% female, which is somewhat appropriate because most of our clients are female, are certainly our survivor clients. But when a survivor gets to speak to a male who is showing up differently, processing differently, providing different safety planning and inputting, within the realm, that's also really great for that survivor.
Hmm.
Because if we're, been around men who are violent our entire lives, or at least that's our most sort of prevalent male, finding men that aren't that way is also a realization that the whole world is not wired for violence in the way that I've experienced it. And so yes, I do think all movements, whether it's education or whatever, need to strive for equality within the ranks of where the work is, right? Because it's valuable. It is valuable, and I've got some phenomenal folks that are on the front line here that are male that they process a little bit differently, which is great because the dynamics of a conversation are better when the diversity, both gender, race, ethnicity, all those things are made stronger when the group is more diverse.
I agree with that wholeheartedly. I was one of the first interviews I've done. It was with this guy Mike, and he was on a board over in England, and I forget the company he was working with. He's a black male, and they used him as the token black man at first, and they gave him a position of power, but he didn't feel like he had the voice to be able to speak. And having that diversity allows people to have that ability to speak up, to be seen, to be witnessed, instead of actually just being, hey, I'm just a figurehead or I'm just a person. They're not
Mm-hmm.
going to listen to me. The other aspect I wanted to really highlight when you were saying having a person that has been abused and talking to people that can hear them, I had the opportunity of doing something similar but very different. I spoke on a veteran board for a crisis intervention training for a bunch of police officers and correction officers about how PTSD can manifest and how it can look different, and how can we be able to start humanizing a person in that situation instead of thinking that they're just being reacting or hostile. Like if we're working with a person that's always being abused their whole life and that's all they know, or they're living in the limbic part of their brain of the fight and flight, how are they supposed to have this emotion regulation if somebody's not be able to hold that space with them to allow them to know that how you're feeling is natural, it's safe, it's okay, but
Mm-hmm.
I'm not going to trigger you, I'm not going to push against you, but I want to be able to hear your story, and I
Yeah.
want you to know that you are safe. And even that this might not feel safe, I want you to be okay not feeling safe, but creating a safe place for that person.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, one of the things we don't talk about enough in society is how our brains get wired for dopamine and all of the chemicals that happen when we have high intensity moments, right? And one of the things that we work with both our abusers and our survivors on is life without violence initially is going to feel very, very boring because your brain is not your friend in this instant. It is craving that dopamine reaction from heightened awareness, heightened violence, whatever the rhythms have been before. And so when what we see in our abuser groups, which is one of the reasons why we are pushing for survivor groups to run alongside, especially if the couple's going to stay together, how do I run a survivor group alongside that abuser group? Because the survivor needs to understand the abuser's learning to walk away, to de-escalate, to not engage. But then if you're interpreting that as, well, you no longer care for me, or this is how we've always engaged, and now you're just ignoring me, you're getting outraged, and that can lead to a different outcome, right? So understanding how your brain, first of all, what other people are learning, especially in a couples situation, but how your brain, like when you're not having those like walk on eggshells, accelerate, fight, come back down, when you're not having that, your brain is going to crave it, and your brain is going to interpret that to think that you're incredibly bored, that you need to do something, you're going to feel antsy, you're I have found that as long as we're explaining that to you, things get easier, because it's like, okay, I'm feeling incredibly bored right now. What am I going to do to fill that space that is good for me versus some violence, or drinking or drug use or some of the other things you could fill with? I mean, we're in Vegas, so pick your poison, right? How do we have a healthy regulation of our brain so that the brain waves can start to just mellow out and you can live in a calm space? It's the same way for some of our survivors when they start in a new and maybe potentially healthy relationship, and they're not getting that same reaction. They're looking for it, right? And so now I'm in a whole different space of crazy, which is just your brain not being your friend. But if we explain it to you and you understand why that's happening, that's a very different situation than I just think something's wrong with me. Because without information, you kind of are like, you're Googling it, which may or may not be helpful. But you're certainly not aware of why you're feeling the way you're feeling, which can lead to other outcomes.
Circling back to, this is going to deal with the dopamine, but circling back to the ACE score, like
Yeah,
growing up in a household with my father, and God rest my father's soul, my father was behaving the way that he understood, and my house was quite a bit chaotic, a lot of yelling, a lot of violence, but at the same time, it was a person who didn't know how to be able to converse or be able to react, and that bled into my relationships, led into other people's relationships that I know, where it's we would create a problem with our significant other just so we can have that volatility, so we can have that affirmation of, hey, they love me because this is them trying, instead of being able to trust the silence to be able to be okay.
yeah,
And since the regulations weren't spiking as much, I was not able to have that type of peace because I didn't think that was okay.
yeah,
And you see this with other people that working with, that they're looking for that, those spikes, to have somewhat where that's their homeostasis. And when you start to help them be able to say flatline or be able to be okay with this, hey, it doesn't have to be crazy. You can have those little bit of ups and downs, but it doesn't mean that we need to create all these big ripples.
yeah,
And unfortunately, with dopamine, I was learning about this semester in my substance abuse class of why we get addicted to not supplements, but actually like marijuana or alcohol, but or methamphetamines. Like dopamine hits. So it's just say a scale 1 to 100. 92 is having sex. 94 is eating the favorite food. You're doing meth for the first time. It's like 1200. You're
yeah,
doing alcohol and other stuff. It's over 100 and change. And why are we keep going to these dopamines? Is because we're feeling this the heightened state of arousal that's making us think that this is okay and this is normal.
yeah.
And it makes sense why it happens in abuses as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's and I think the harder thing, right, for if you've encountered abuse your whole life, your frontal lobe, which is sort of cemented when you're 25, it's sort of the hardwired to think that that's normal. And so breaking that and that environment in your brain is, it's not as easy as like just, okay, don't be abusive, right? Like, it's easy for me to sit here and say, just don't abuse, right? That's not helpful. When your brain is hardwired for that, right? So we're talking with someone who's 35 and their whole life has been in abuse. Their brain is cemented to believe that these rhythms of dopamine and this disruptions of serotonin and violence and all these things, it's all hardwired in my computer.
Hmm.
And so breaking that cycle it really does take a full understanding, and probably, like, we do 26 weeks, we have voluntary classes after that. This is years of work to understand your brain. I think that gets not understood enough, right? We think it's the same with obesity, right? We think, oh, just stop eating so much, exercise more, get some self control. We're really not. That's very unfair to the person who's suffering from the condition, because there's a lot of things that go into obesity. There are a lot of things that go into violence there, that make it a complex sort of addiction to break. And so the movement, the feminist movement that really brought domestic violence to the forefront of the public space versus being a private issue, hasn't done a yeoman's job in explaining that alongside what a survivor is experiencing. And so then how do we break that cycle, right? And that's really at the nexus of, like, I think the next iteration of the anti-domestic violence movement has to be this understanding of the brain, understanding of lifelong violence, understanding of what does it take to break that cycle, and
Mhm.
how can we be more effective at that, because we're really just saying, well, let's incarcerate you for 35 days, which is the average incarceration for a domestic violence abuser. Let's incarcerate you, and that somehow is going to solve the problem, which is just ridiculous, right? We why would we think that that's going to solve anything? So yeah, I think there's a huge opportunity, and not domestic violence is of course a space I'm passionate and work in, but I think this understanding of the brain is actually very, very relevant for a lot of the things that we're trying to understand. PTSD. I mean, I'm here in Nevada, I'm seeing a lot of psychedelic bills come through our legislation to try and legalize the ability to use microdosing to rewire some of the brain. I think that could be some of the most phenomenal, done right, done with the right research, done with the right doctor, done with all the right steps, could be some of the most phenomenal changes in psychology and how we deal with these issues available.
Psychedelics is definitely something I have looked into. I've even partaked in a heroic dose of psilocybins that was done by a buddy of mine. And I agree under the right guise, not just getting high to get high, but the neuroplasticity and how it is able to really start to accept new patterns, new recognition. But I also believe that the integration under the right guise of somebody helping you get there to when you're getting out of it is important because it to me it's very similar to like I did a residential treatment program for post traumatic stress disorder for 13 weeks.
Okay.
And when I did that, I didn't go back to the same community because I ended up selling my house and I moved to Montana, didn't know anybody. And when I did that, you realize that you go back to the same people that is used to you behaving these certain patterns. When you do these certain patterns, then they help push you to go back to that same person because they are expecting that same type of results. So again, I agree with the psychedelics being super important, but with the right types of therapists. Not just saying that this is the cure all, but this is a way of, hey, we can heal together. And now we can change. And there was something I remember hearing. There was people who started healing from the psychedelics. Their partners were like, hey, you know what? What about us? What about all the trauma that we endured, the
Yeah.
secondary trauma?
Yeah.
And how are they supposed to heal together? And now it's actually creating these new relationships, being okay of like going back to say walking on eggshells. Well, this person that come in and yell at me, they're really nice. So are they going to hit me now? Are they going to actually come in and start cursing at me? And you're waiting for it. And that anxiety might be even worse than the physical abuse.
Hmm.
But now accepting that new relationship with that person that you're getting a chance to know, it creates huge ripples in people's relationships with their partners, their family, their friends, even their community.
Yeah, so much of this, it cannot be done in a vacuum, right? It's if you have the ability like you did to get up and move, like, great. But coming out of domestic violence, particularly if that couple is going to stay together, that healing has to be done in concert. And that's again another part of, I think, the movement sort of like still has a premium on, well, you never get back together with your abuser, which is not the reality. 63 to 70% of couples get back together. And so, how are we creating environments where that can be healthy? Because if the movement stands in this place saying, oh no, there's a premium on being apart, and that's what we measure success by, then we're missing really what our survivors want. And our survivors have been very clear. I mean, we did a research that's just been published that survivors want, the number one thing is the violence to stop. The number two thing is to be believed. It isn't till way down on the bottom of that list that they say punishment. Like it's almost the last thing that they're looking for. They're not looking for punishment for their abusive partner. They're looking for a healthy relationship. They want the violence to stop. They want to be able to be with this person without the walking on eggshells, and for all different reasons. Some of it might be driven by financial, some of it might be driven by religion, culture, family. There are a multitude of reasons survivors will want to stay with that person who they have a relationship with. And as a movement, we have to stop saying, hey, the premium here is on you leaving. That shows real strength as a survivor. And we need to stop saying the criminal justice system will deal with the abuser. We need to start saying, okay, is there a possibility for this relationship to be healthy, to be fulfilling, to be violence free? And what does that path to each one of those look like, right? And that's got to be done in concert. Some of it has to be done apart, but most of it has to be done together, because the couple has to realize how they're going to work together. How are they going to deal with the boredom of the non dopamine? How are they going to deal with all of these things? Because if they're going to be a unit, they need to be a unit together. And that's really missed inside this movement.
So I know you spoke about trainings. What kind of trainings do you guys have for people? Does it have to be in person or can it be done virtually? And is there ones for CEUs for say social workers, licensed clinical professionals, and how do people get in touch with you about these things?
Yes, so we do have a robust training program. Most of what we do is, and yes, CEUs can be incorporated depending on the group, but most of what we do is custom, right? Because everybody, I have found, we used to kind of package our trainings, which we do for like HR departments. So if you're in a workplace and your HR department needs to know about DV, usually that's cited by an incident, then we've got some packages that we can do in that space. But if you're a social worker and you're interested in learning maybe more about some of these topics that I've talked about, you can just reach out to us, either our website at safenest.org, or you can email info@safenest.org, and we'll get in touch with you. My training team will, to do a custom training for your team, because everybody comes at this different spaces of agreeing or not agreeing with what I'm saying, different spaces on wanting to work in a dynamic where we're bringing couples together. That's really kind of unusual, but we're happy to lay the seeds to talk about it and say, how could you do this in your community? What does this look like? What are the pitfalls? Where are the risks? And move that conversation forward.
Have you guys expanded further than Nevada as far as having hubs?
No, no, we are. Anybody who knows about domestic violence funding realizes it's very hard to be multi state. Most of our funding streams require that we only serve Nevada. And so, yeah, we are Nevada focused, but happy to train well outside of that. And we work with survivors from all over the country because Vegas is a hub. Lots of people find themselves here from all over the world that they need help and support, but our services are located primarily in Clark County, Nevada, which is the home of Las Vegas.
Is there Has anybody else taken up pretty much the same, or do you know of any organizations that have taken up pretty much the same stance that you guys are doing as far as getting people connected and intertwined into the DV world?
Not kind of in the space. We're part of obviously the domestic violence, sexual assault coalitions, and then we're also part of a group called Alliance for Hope International that runs family justice centers, which are hubs of multiple services happening out of one place. Both groups were well represented. Neither group has an arm for abusers. So I always find that interesting. These are sort of the two primary kind of organizations, sort of nationally running domestic violence work. And I'm like, what are we doing? So we really feel like we are pushing that forward in a different way than most other organizations. I will say it's tough, and I want to just sort of say for a second, federal funding, which is maybe a quarter of my budget, is most organizations are much more reliant on federal funding, and it's really short-sighted in that most federal funding doesn't allow you to work with the abuser. And so finding funding for that particular part of our work, we have some business entities, so we kind of self-fund some of that. But I would say that it doesn't mean domestic violence agencies don't want to. It means they haven't figured out how to pay for it,
Hmm.
because the funding is very, very limited, if at all available.
So, why do you think, or I don't even want to use that one. What have you seen with the abuser being able to heal? How has it translated not only for the partner but also for the family? Do you have any good stories that you could be able to share so that can create a little bit more buy-in for people to realize we need to help the abuser, not just the person that's been abused?
Yeah, so I will tell you, we had a 19-year-old kid in our abusive partner program. So 19 is an adult, so he was in our adult program, and he had a 3-year-old. So obviously he had that child, I think when he was 15, maybe 16. So he is an overwhelmed 19-year-old kid who is already in domestic violence treatment. That's like already, right? We're all concerned. So we're all mandated reporters. He admitted in training that he had punched his 3-year-old son in the stomach. And so my therapist did what I would hope any therapist would do, pulled him aside and said, look, as you know, I'm mandated to report this, so I'm going to report it. But I would like for you to skip your next 6 group sessions, and I would like for you to come in for individual counseling. And so we have a great working relationship with Child Protective Services. Explained to them, obviously made the report, explained to them, here's what we're offering. We did the 6 weeks of private one on one with him. I was very proud that he showed up, right? Because sometimes the buy in is hard, to your point. He showed up, and then a couple weeks later, after he had finished the 6 weeks, he's back in his group program, and he said he's explaining how angry he was getting with his son. I mean, 3-year-olds are tough, right? Like we all know this, but he's explaining how angry he's getting with his son. And then he explains, I shut my son in his bedroom, and he went on to say, look, everything in the room is safe. Okay, so the dresser is affixed to the wall, did all the right dad stuff for a 19-year-old. I was immensely proud. And he said, and I closed his door and I went and I walked around the block. That is absolute success. And this is what I think folks struggle with, right? We want to go from this person who's been surrounded by abuse their whole life, punched their kid. We want to say, well, you're a horrible person. Let's incarcerate you. You need to not be around kids. Let's remove your son. We went from that with some personal interaction with this guy and just helping him de escalate his own stress and trauma and reactivity to him being able to walk around the block with his son shut in his room for he said he was probably gone for 5 to 10 minutes. That's success. And I think understanding and then applauding that small step is really where we build, start to rewire that brain for what success feels like, right? And he was beaming. I mean, the guys in the class were clapping for him. He was beaming. And that is what success looks like, right? It can be to us so minute, but there is no. I say this all the time. There isn't. If we believe everybody can just be thrown away because they've done something horrible, we will be left with a society of no one.
Hmm.
We need to see the redeemability, and if you can take responsibility for your abusive behavior and then really want to make a change, then there's a path. right? Sometimes getting to that responsibility is really hard. But when we can build the right pathways to do that, then there's there's hope.
Liz, I love the fact that you were able to look at it as a positive and a win, and same thing with the other guys, because certain people will be so quick to say that's abuse too. How come you're not doing it better? And instead of realizing that these incremental baby steps are huge wins for people, and if we keep pushing the ball in the right direction and praising them on the wins instead of beating them, we're
Yeah.
able to then actually have a much better society.
Yep.
So, so, Liz, is there any message that you want to give, and also more of a plug into get in touch with your organization?
Yeah. So if you're out there and you feel like maybe when you come home, your kids are looking at you scared, maybe your significant other is nervous, feels like people are walking on eggshells, if there's tension in your house, we have an abusive partner hotline right alongside our survivor hotline, and the advocates are trained to help de escalate some of that abuse you might be bringing into the home, but recognizing that you are bringing that energy into the home, and that in of itself is abuse. If you've lost your temper, punched a hole in the wall, if you've lost your temper and hit your spouse or your significant other or a kid or a pet, there's help for you. And that's confidential, it's anonymous, and it's free. And that number 702-646-4981, right alongside our, that's also our number for survivors if you're out there suffering. But you can have fully committed, loving relationships in which you maintain your manhood, because I know that's important for folks, but that you're creating an environment of love and partnership and not fear and intimidation. And that's really the message that I think is so important. This does not have to be the way anybody lives.
I really have been looking forward to this conversation for several weeks, maybe about a month, and I wanted to say it worked out better than I thought it was going to be. And Liz, you're an amazing human, and I appreciate your time. And I'm so glad that the people reached out to me on your behalf because, like I said, you're just a phenomenal human.
Thank you. I That's very humbling, and I am one of the fortunate people that does a job I love every single day, and I see so much hope for everybody that's struggling inside this epidemic on all sides of the equation.
How do you think?